Okay, looks like everyone's sound is working. Brittany, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to the second installment of the FY 2020 AmeriCorps State and National Grant Competition webinar series. Today's session is entitled Best Practices in Budget Development. CNCS is recording this webinar and will post the session recording and slide deck on the FY 2020 NOFO page on nationalservice.gov in the days following this presentation. We encourage your engagement in the webinar. You may use the Q&A feature, as Jeff mentioned just previously, to ask questions at any time, although we may not respond immediately. Please be patient if we do not answer your question right away. Before asking a question, please know that CNCS will not respond to questions about the specific content of your proposed budget. Applicants should use the NOFO and application instructions to determine the most appropriate budget that meets the state requirements. If you have any technical difficulties during this session, please let us know through the chat box so our webinar facilitator can assist you via private chat. I would now like to turn over the webinar to today's presenter, Tracy Siebold, Senior Grants Management Training Specialist with CNCS's Office of Grants Administration. Tracy?
Thanks, Brittany. I'm delighted to join you and our AmeriCorps applicants today, and thanks to all of you for spending the next hour of your day with us as we discuss ways to develop a compliant and competitive AmeriCorps budget. Before I get started, I recommend that you shut down any other windows you have open on your computer. This will ensure that you get the optimal bandwidth and the best audio experience. As a result, maximize your learning experience. As Brittany stated, we will use that Q&A feature for you to ask questions throughout this presentation. And again, I want to remind you, we will not address any questions that are specific to the content of your budget. Rather, we will provide clarifications to help you submit the most compliant budget possible. My colleague, Philip Stonecipher, one of CNCS's Grants Management Specialists, is monitoring the Q&A feature and will help to answer any simple clarifications if needed. Otherwise, we'll pause throughout the presentation to read and answer your questions out loud. Additionally, we will check your understanding of various concepts by asking you questions throughout this session. And please respond to these questions in the chat box. Now, enter yes in that chat box if you're excited to get started. Perfect. Before I move to the content of today's session, do know that we posted a sample budget narrative on the AmeriCorps State and National Grants FY 2020 funding page. And as Brittany said, we'll also post a recording of this presentation for your future reference. And I also want to thank you for responding to the poll questions as you waited for this session to start. Knowing who is in the room really helps us focus on the points that are most relevant to you. So speaking of those poll questions, I noticed that a few of you on this webinar are fixed award applicants, and I welcome you. You should know, however, that a majority of this discussion will focus on budgets that are submitted as part of a cost reimbursement application. And although fixed award recipients aren't subject to the same budget and cost principle requirements as the cost reimbursement award recipients, this conversation really will help all applicants, both cost reimbursement and fixed award applicants, improve their fiscal management responsibilities. So if you are planning to submit a fixed award application, you may find the information helpful, and we welcome you to remain connected to this session. On the flip side, if you decide that it's a better use of your time to disconnect, we're not offended if you drop off. So my goal for today's session is to help you, the AmeriCorps grant applicant, acquire the knowledge and skills needed to understand the function of and to develop an effective AmeriCorps budget and budget narrative. Your submission of a complete and high-quality budget will help demonstrate that you have the fiscal capacity to manage an AmeriCorps program. During this session, we will holistically review the components of an AmeriCorps budget, which includes both the CNCS resources and the applicant's matching resources. And at the end of the webinar, you should understand how to determine if the costs are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable as determined by 2 CFR 200, the Office of Management and Budget's Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards, frequently referred to as the Uniform Guidance. Using this information and the tips and best practices shared here, you should be prepared to submit a compliant and competitive budget. Because the budget and budget narrative become part of the grant recipient's contract with CNCS, we want and expect applicants to present a strong and accurate document. The approved budget will not only serve as a financial guide for grant-supported activities, but it helps to ensure the terms and conditions of the award. In addition to helping CNCS monitor grant and financial compliance, it can serve as a tool for both CNCS and award recipients to measure progress toward the match requirements and monitor budgeted expenses to actual expenses as part of your budget management process. Before we dive into the details of budget development, I want to point out that budget development is just one component of an effective budget management process. So let's take a quick look at the full process. As you started to work on your AmeriCorps application, you may have asked yourself, how do I design a strong budget? Quick check, did you ask that question? There's no right or wrong answer, but if you actually said, how do I design a strong budget, either to yourself or to others, type me in the chat box, please. All right, we've got at least one person, 2 people. All right, great. Good to see that you all are asking that question before you start. And whether or not you started the process with the question, as part of that pre-award project development process, it's likely that your team already determined the needs that you wanted to address with AmeriCorps resources. You set up program or project goals and objectives, and you decided on a strategy to accomplish those goals. To develop the budget, applicants must then translate that strategy into dollars to prepare a budget that's aligned with the stated program goals and objectives. Post-award, grantees will continue to manage their budgets effectively by establishing a budget control process, monitoring expenses, that is regularly comparing your budgeted to actual expenses to check for over and underspending, and modifying the budget as needed with approval from CNCS when required. Today's conversation will focus on that budget preparation process. Let's talk about your approved budget. It should be realistic. That is, it should reflect expected program revenues and expenses and its capacity to carry out program activities. It should be consistent and aligned with the program's goals and objectives, and it should be flexible. A project's financial and operating circumstances often change, and the budget must adapt to those changing circumstances. So for now, we'll just focus on the realistic and consistent features as they relate to budget design. A few minutes ago, I outlined the steps that your team may have taken as part of the budget development process. CNCS encourages applicants to approach budget design as a team activity, engaging various departments based on their individual expertise. What departments or individuals could you involve in your budget design team? Use the chat feature to suggest those different departments and individuals that could support you in this endeavor. And think about the specific expertise they bring to the process. Anyone want to make a suggestion there? Integrity specialists and compliance. Program, finance, executive directors, finance, yep. Exactly, we've got a couple of good ideas here. Yeah, your finance, your accounting office, they're going to have your historical spending rates for costs. And likewise, yes, program manager, they're going to know the cost for training members, for delivering the services to the community. Human resources, payroll costs, absolutely. Fringe, your criminal history check costs. Your grants office should be able to review for compliance, and I assume that that's probably similar to the integrity specialist that's listed up there. Other staff in your organization may have additional expertise that they can bring, or they can review your budget for clarity. Your budget should be able to stand as a document in itself to describe what you're doing. And so you want to make sure that it's as clear as possible, that you don't have calculation errors. So don't be afraid to involve as many others as are required to present the most realistic data in the budget and make sure that that document aligns with your programmatic goals and objectives. We also recommend that applicants use historical information when possible. As a reminder, your accounting department should have that information and adjust as necessary so that the data is more timely. And then make sure you're including that information as part of your budget narrative description. So if you're using a cost from 2018 in a 2019 budget or a 2020 budget, then you're going to say this is based on historical use adjusted, for real time, words to that effect. But your strong budget design will provide the framework that you need for effective budget management. It will ensure that realistic scope, appropriate detail, a competitive proposal, compliance, and effective delivery. That is, it will serve as your guide for program implementation. In order to create a budget that is strong, accurate, and requires minimal clarification, I really encourage you to take your time and engage others in the data collection and quality review. As I previously noted, one of the objectives for this session is to provide you with tips and tools for creating a competitive budget narrative. The first tip is to read and follow the instructions in the NOFO and application instructions, which include minimum and maximum cost levels and required line items, both which we'll discuss later in this presentation. The strongest and most compliant budget narratives adhere to these guidelines, and it saves all of us time and effort later. I also encourage you to become familiar with the uniform guidance and only include those costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. You can find this online at ecfr.gov under Title II, Grants and Agreements. After you and your team estimate the financial resources you need to achieve the stated program goals, you will organize them into the narrative's budget categories, again, following the guidance in the NOFO and the application instructions. As you develop the narrative, remember to provide adequate descriptions and clear calculations. eGrants will automatically populate a budget summary and budget narrative report that should be able to serve as that standalone document I referenced, without a need to go back to the application narrative for explanation. And that's where that suggestion to have someone outside of your team look at this to make sure there are no holes, no inaccuracies, that's where that really comes in handy. The uniform guidance, as well as the NOFO and application instructions, specify costs considered unallowable, such as lobbying, entertainment, alcoholic beverages, and fundraising. CNCS strongly encourages applicants to review the uniform guidance to avoid including any of those unallowable costs in your proposed budget. Other unallowable costs include those that are not necessary to meet the program objectives. For example, budgeting new laptop computers for 20 staff members when only 2 staff are included in your AmeriCorps budget is not allowable and could be waste, fraud, or abuse. Another example is budgeting $6,000 for landscaping equipment and materials for a program that's focused on literacy. Those are costs that would be considered unreasonable from a prudent person perspective or have no logical basis for inclusion in the budget. It's important to remember that if a cost is unallowable as part of the CNCS share, it is also unallowable as part of the grantee share or your required match. As shown on the visual here, the grantee share of total costs increases over time, reaching 50% or a minimum dollar-for-dollar match by year 10. Cash and in-kind contributions are acceptable match when they are verifiable from the organization's records, when they are necessary and reasonable for proper and efficient accomplishment of project or program objectives, when they are allowable under the uniform guidance and application instructions, when they are not paid for by the federal government under another award except when authorized by federal statute, when they are included in the approved budget and allowable under program guidelines, and when they are compliant with the terms and conditions of the award and the uniform guidance. The matching resources must be treated the same as the CNCS share, and consistent treatment includes complete and accurate documentation. A frequently heard phrase in the world of grants management is, if it isn't documented, it didn't happen. Please make sure to document all your expenses. Let me go back to the point that matching resources are allowable when they are not paid for by the federal government under another award, except when authorized by federal statute. CNCS legislation permits the use of non-CNCS federal funds for the grantee share of the AmeriCorps budget. If you plan to include non-CNCS federal funds as match, you should discuss your intention with the other agency prior to submitting your application, and know that you must report the use of those other federal funds on your federal financial report to CNCS. Also, keep in mind that you may not use other CNCS resources as match for an AmeriCorps award. Because applicants must demonstrate an adequate plan for non-CNCS support, they're required to include the source of match in the budget narrative, entering a description of the source along with the amount, a cash or in-kind classification, the type of match source, that is, whether it's coming from state or local government, federal funds, or private donations, and a confirmation of whether the sources of match are secured or proposed. You do not need to secure 100% of your match prior to submitting the application, but anticipated match must be included, and the total of this section must equal the amount of match shown in the budget. Also, please note that eGrants rounds the budgeted match up to the nearest percentage. So for example, a budget with 49.7% match will appear to match at 50%, even though it's not a dollar for dollar match. So I recommend that you calculate the percentage outside of eGrants to make sure that you are meeting or exceeding that required percentage. So let's pause briefly and see if there are any questions at this point. If you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A feature now.
So we had two questions that came through. The first came from Robin in relation to the NOFA. And I pulled up the NOFA, and that's on page 21 that she's referencing. So do we want to address that a little later? So the question that we have there, or from Robin, is, I no longer thought there was an application narrative, and so can you confirm? And then from the NOFA on page 21, it says this criteria will be assessed based on the budget submitted. No narrative should be entered in the narrative box except for the budget.
Good question, Robin, and a lot of that is the terminology that we all use. So there is that section there. You don't need to enter any information in that. When we talk about a budget narrative, it really is the detailed portion of the budget that is populated by the data that you're entering in that budget section. So when you're putting in there a travel cost and you're describing how you came up with that calculation, and you're using all those words, not just the numbers that show the CNCS and the match pieces of it, that is what populates the budget narrative. And when we're talking about a budget narrative, that's what we're speaking of, not the narrative piece of the application. Thank you for that question.
There's another good question that came in from Sarah. It said, you know, what if the funds are from the state, but originally came from a federal government? Is that considered federal?
That's a great question. Thank you, Sarah. To the extent you are able, you want to be able to tell us where the funds are coming from. If you were getting it, though, from your state government, chances are good that, and this goes back to that reporting piece, chances are good that they're going to be reporting to the federal government, here's how we're expending those funds. I would recommend that in the source of funds section, you're saying, you know, we're getting this from our state's Head Start grant. And we know that those are federal funds, and you're going to say that it's federal funds, but you'll have the opportunity to give that level of detail that this is coming from a state program, not directly from the program. If that, hopefully that clarifies that for you.
And then the final question I'm seeing right now is, are FFS forms required for federal funds being administered through the city? Those FFS forms required?
I'm not sure what you're referencing by an FFS form.
And I'm not either, as a grants officer.
The reporting forms. Are you referring to the federal financial reports? Excellent. So let me go back to the first question. Are FFRs required for federal funds being administered through the city? I can't answer that question because that sounds like you're asking a question about an award you're getting from your city. You are required to submit a federal financial report to two different federal financial reports on any AmeriCorps awards. You'll submit quarterly disbursement reports, and then to CNCS, you'll report generally semi-annual expenditure reports. And the terms and conditions of those reporting requirements are outlined in the terms and conditions of your award.
Yeah, and then we had one additional question here. I think it says, if we include more match than needed, will we be held to the submitted budget match or the regulatory level?
Great question. So CNCS holds you accountable at the period of grant closeout for the regulatory match. So that amount that was outlined in slide 8. But when you receive an award, you will see your budgeted match is X amount, your regulatory match is a different amount, or maybe it's the same. We also assess your ability to meet your budgeted amount as well. That is part of the contract that you have with CNCS, is what you put in your budget, and that's what you were expecting to budget or to include as far as matching resources. So we do expect that you are going to meet that commitment. So that's why we also caution you to be very careful of budgeting what you think you need to put in there, both for our share and for the matching resources, and what's also feasible for you. Okay. Before I move on, while we're talking about match too, I want to point out that while there are no match requirements for the fixed amount grants, applicants are required to enter the source of matching funds in those budgets. So if you're applying for a fixed amount award, please make sure to complete that section to show how you're covering the program costs beyond those provided by CNCS. As you enter data in the budget, you will notice that it includes both the CNCS and grantee shares of project costs. Additionally, the budget identifies costs into direct and indirect or administrative costs. And then the direct costs include program operating costs and member costs, which the budget breaks into major categories that may include specific line items such as those shown on the slide. These costs are allocable to the grant. That is, they're associated with grant-related activities. General or centralized organizational expenses spread across the entire organization are indirect or administrative costs. And as you, the AmeriCorps applicant, develop your budget management systems and specifically the budget control process, you'll want to establish clear policies and procedures for tracking and documenting those expenses. So let's look at some specific budget categories and the related guidance in the AmeriCorps application instructions, beginning with Section 1, the program operating costs. In personnel expenses, you will individually list each staff position supported by the grant and provide the annual salary and level of effort as a percentage of the FTE devoted to the award. In doing so, please remember to only include positions that are supported by the application narrative, and make sure not to include the value of direct community service performed by volunteers, unless it's for organizational functions such as accounting or auditing or training. In addition, if you have multiple CNCS grants, it's a good idea to confirm that you are not over budgeting, or rather including more than 100% of staff time on your budgets. You can do this simply by adding a statement in each line or at the end of the section that states the percentage of time allocated to budgeted staff does not exceed 100% across all CNCS grants. Additionally, you should confirm that the salary information you provide is consistent across the multiple grants. While it might be appropriate to budget the executive director's salary as $89,000 on one application and $99,000 on another that you submitted 6 months later, you could also add an explanation that the higher salary reflects the cost of living and performance-related salary increase. That just gives us a little bit more information and could prevent some additional clarifications. In the fringe benefits section, you will identify the type of fringe benefit, for example, FICA, workers' compensation, retirement, unemployment, health insurance, and the cost for each staff. Fringe benefit costs should align with the salary lines. That is, they should only include staff included in the personnel expenses section. And if the benefit amount is more than 30% of salary costs, you must list covered benefits separately and justify the cost. For example, you would enter health insurance at 24%, retirement at 10%, FICA at 7.65%, and so on. In the travel section, you will include the purpose and cost, or purpose of the cost and the type of travel, such as air and ground transportation, lodging, and per diem. You also want to include the number of trips, the number of staff or members traveling, and make sure that the calculation is clear and simple to follow. I want to note that CNCS-sponsored technical assistance is an expectation of all applicants, and travel funds should be budgeted for new state commission and national direct staff to attend the AmeriCorps Symposium pre-conference events. Please take care to separate staff and member travel costs and ensure that training costs are not included in that section. And likewise, that travel costs aren't included in the training lines. Those are frequent errors that we find in these budgets. Also note that you may budget mileage at a rate higher than the federal reimbursement rate, which is currently 58% or 58 cents a mile, if that follows your organization's policy. And if so, please make a note in the budget narrative that this is aligned with your policy. Equipment is defined as tangible, non-expendable personal property having a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more per unit. If it's less, that expense goes in supplies. Excuse me. Equipment is also limited to 10% of the total CNCS funds requested, and you must show the unit cost and number of units with the purpose of equipment. Supplies are consumable supplies and materials, including member service gear. AmeriCorps identity items, preferably clothing with a logo, is a required budget expense and may be charged to the CNCS share only if it includes the AmeriCorps logo. Applicants should make a note in the budget narrative when items include the logo. You may charge safety gear to the CNCS share regardless of whether it has a logo or not, and all other member service gear must be purchased with non-CNCS funds. And please make sure to individually list single items costing $1,000 or more. The contractual and consultant services section includes all contractual and consultant services except training and evaluation consultants. And while CNCS does not impose a maximum daily rate, we ask that you include the rate on which you are determining your expense. And again, I caution you not to include the value of direct community service unless it is for organizational functions. The training sections include both staff and member training. Staff training enhances staff skills for effective project implementation, and member training supports members as they carry out their service activities, and it may include Life After AmeriCorps training. Again, please be sure to include a daily rate for the consultants if used, and if not, some type of detail that justifies the cost. In the evaluation section, you will include project evaluation costs like additional staff, consultants, evaluation instruments, and the like. This is not for assessing your progress toward your performance measures, but it truly is an evaluation of the impact on community and the assessment of the overall program design and systems. The other program costs is kind of a catch-all category for those projected expenses that don't neatly fit in other categories. In this section, you must include your national service criminal history checks for members, employees, and others who receive a salary, education award, living allowance, or stipend. And if not included, explain how those costs are covered or that the checks were already completed. You might also include office space, utilities, phone, internet for members and project staff, providing that these expenses are not included as part of the organization's approved indirect cost rate and that they are prorated and appropriately allocated to the project. Member recognition costs, which are allowable if appropriately justified, and exclude gifts and food provided in an entertainment setting, are also allowable in this section. And if you're a multi-state applicant, you may include subgrants here, indicating the approximate number and average amount of the awards. Show any required subgrantee match in that grantee share column, though, please. All right, well, let's pause again briefly to check if we have any questions, and if you do, please enter them in the Q&A feature. Philip, do we have any?
Well, actually, I have just one quick question. As a new applicant's preparing their budget for submission, would they submit a one-year budget or a three-year budget for the whole three-year grant cycle?
They will submit a one-year budget. And if this is a brand new applicant, you'll get an award, generally speaking, for a three-year period. And it'll show that those funds are available for the 3 years, but you will budget on an annual basis.
Thanks. And that was kind of, and then we have a couple more questions. One is, in the sample budget, member training consultants are included in the consultant section F. Can you please clarify that a little bit?
That would have been incorrect on our part. So thank you for pointing that out. We'll fix that in the future.
Good question. And then there was one other one. Do we budget for federal and state background checks?
Yes, the guidance for your criminal history checks is in the NOFO and in the application instructions, and you'll need to budget accordingly. Again, if you don't have those expenses, just please explain why. If they're paid for outside of the budget, or if you've already covered the cost of those.
Thanks for that. And then there was one other question that just came in. Can in-kind services be used and matched? I.e., like, can a trainer who donates time to conduct a member training?
Yes, absolutely. Your match is made up of both cash and in-kind resources. And when you complete the source of funds section, you will clarify that whether it is cash or whether it's an in-kind donation, and just let us know that that is the source. And you can say it's professional services. If you look at that sample budget, you'll see that that's one of the sources in there is professional services as in kind.
And one additional question, is it true that even if an FTE, a full-time employee, is only supporting the project for 5%, they also need to have a federal background check?
The National Service Criminal History Check requirement is for all members, employees, and others who receive a salary, education award, living allowance, or stipend, no matter how much, how little. Good questions. Thank you all. So let's review some budget narrative sample entries and talk through some of the common clarification issues that applicants can avoid. Look at this sample here and see what errors you can identify in this staff travel entry. Enter those in the chat, please. I'll give you a couple seconds here. All right, as you all are looking at it, I'm going to start the review of it, and hopefully you can, well, not enough detail for sure. Mileage rate higher than the federal rate. Yeah, so if you look at that first entry for the grantee training, it says to staff, but that's pretty much not any detail. So we would want to know, okay, what does that mean exactly? The mileage rate higher than the allowable, like I said before, it could be allowable providing that it aligns with the organization's policy. And this applicant could have avoided a clarification by putting just a simple notation in there that this follows the organization's travel policy. And you can see in that member travel section, it does say mileage rate determined by state policy. So if they added language like that, that would be perfect. The third line there, that regional training conference line, that shows that the applicant did not double check the calculations for accuracy. The details in the description total $2,050 rather than the budgeted $1,954. And this is also often a result of applicants revising and re-revising the budget sections, and that's why you can't double check enough. The last line in here is for member travel, and if you note, this is for staff travel. There are two different sections, so this is an appropriate line item, but it's in the wrong section, and this is something that we'd want to go back and we'd get the applicant to move this into the appropriate section. So again, this is why it's important to check and double check your work. So if we look at this other example here, this shows a correct and comprehensive entry. You'll see that there's adequate detail included for each line item, including the number of individuals traveling, the number of travel days or miles traveled, and a mileage rate, and all calculations total the budgeted amounts. There's no erroneous cost included in this section. So that's the goal, is for that second version. All right, let's look at another sample for the supply section. Take a look at this and see if you can notice anything that jumps out, and enter that in the chat, please. No details for office supplies. Yeah, they've just got the office supply, well, they've got the average of $40 a month, but that looks like 10 months to me, not for a year. And there's no detail for the computers. Are we looking at 2 computers, 1 computer, 15 computers? We don't really know. Yeah, what type? So we'd want to have some detail in there as well. Without that kind of detail, we can't determine if this is reasonable and necessary. And you also need to specifically list out any single supply items with a cost of $1,000 or more per unit. The member supplies section, and looks like Lisa weighed in on this. Yes, the calculation is off. It's higher than what's budgeted. It's $7,030, and they budgeted at $7,000. And because CNCS budget reviews include an assessment of calculation accuracy, if something like this would come through and it said average or approximate, that would give that little bit of wiggle room that we wouldn't hold you to an exact amount. I know sometimes we'll see people doing rounding, and you have to almost guess that that's what they intended to do. But again, adding average, approximate, estimated at, those kind of words gives you that kind of flexibility. Are there any required line items missing from this section? Anybody notice anything? So I said before when we were talking, member gear. Thank you, Ann. Yes, there's no AmeriCorps member service gear. So if you look at the second version here, it shows the member gear with the appropriate detail. It also has the corrected office supplies calculation, details about the computers, and the term approximate in the member supply line. This is a much better and more compliant budget narrative section. So let's move on to section 2, which focuses on member costs, specifically member living allowances and support costs. The NOFA stipulates the minimum and maximum living allowance. This year's full-time living allowance ranges between $14,279 and $28,558 per member. The budget narrative must identify the number of members in each category and the living allowance they'll receive. And then the member support costs must follow the laws of the states where the members serve. Your FICA must be included at 7.65% of total living allowance unless you are exempt by the IRS. You may include workers' comp costs if the state where the members are serving requires it. And if it's not required, programs must obtain occupational accidental death and dismemberment coverage for your members. You must offer health care to all full-time members. Programs may not pay health care benefits to less than full-time members with grant funds unless those less than full-time members are serving in a full-time capacity. And in that case, you should note that in the budget narrative. Please include the number of members receiving that benefit and a per-person cost in the cost calculation. Unemployment insurance and other member support costs must also include adequate calculation details. So let's look at some member support costs entries here. What errors can you identify in these two line items? Enter those in the chat, please. Anyone see any problems? Yeah, the FICA is calculated at an incorrect base. It must be calculated at 7.65 of total living allowances. Anything else? I will point out in the healthcare section, the applicant seems to have estimated that a percentage of eligible members will decline the benefit. And there is no requirement that you provide healthcare benefits to all full-time members, only that you offer it to all full-time members. So this would actually indicate to CNCS that, okay, we're offering it to everyone, but we think that this is who's going to take it, and that goes back to that historical information that you have. They also included healthcare benefits for 8 of the 10 minimum time members. And this could be allowable if those minimum time members are serving in a full-time capacity, such as in a full-time summer program. If this was part of a submitted budget, it would likely result in a request for clarification that these are less than full-time members that are serving in that full-time capacity. Otherwise, that portion of this line item would be unallowable. So this second example includes the correct FICA calculation, and it excludes those minimum time members that in this case were not serving in a full-time capacity. Additionally, this example includes a line for members' worker compensation, which is a required line item. In this situation, it appears that the organization doesn't want to include the cost of the expense in the budget, but they're making sure CNCS knows that they expect to provide coverage for all members by including that as a $0 line item. And this should eliminate questions about the missing line item during a resolution process. So do we have any questions related to Section 2? No? Okay. Then let's move on to administrative and indirect costs. Those are your general or centralized costs that support the project. They do not include specific project costs. They may be included as an organization's indirect cost rate agreement if one exists. There are 3 methods for calculating indirect costs. Regardless of the method, the CNCS share is limited to 5% of total CNCS funds expended. So using the CNCS fixed percentage rate method, which is a 5-10% fixed option, grantees can charge administrative costs without a federally approved indirect cost rate and without documentation to support the allocation. Using this method, applicants can allocate 5% of the CNCS share of direct costs to the CNCS share of administrative costs and 10% of all direct costs to the grantee share of administrative costs. Applicants should follow the guidance in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowed. And if you're allocating less than the maximum to your budget, please note the percentage you're claiming in the narrative. If applicants have a federally approved indirect cost rate, they must use this method, and the approved rate agreement constitutes your documentation of the administrative costs. Again, the CNCS share is limited to 5% of CNCS funds. Please be sure to specify the cost type and supply the rate and base on which it is calculated, whether it's salaries, direct costs, or what have you. And follow the guidance again in the application instructions to calculate the maximum allowed. Applicants must also enter the details of their approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement in eGrants using the guidance in the application instructions. Organizations that never at any point in time held a federally negotiated indirect cost rate and who receive less than $35 million in direct federal funding may indefinitely use a de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct costs. It's important to note that if this option is elected, the organization must use it consistently across all of the organization's federal awards. And guidance for calculating these costs using each of the 3 methods is in the application instructions. It also addresses the situation of commissions electing to retain a portion of administrative costs. So if you're a commission sub-applicant and your commission is retaining a percentage of the administrative costs, please carefully follow the application instructions guidance for this. And if you're a commission, please check to make sure your sub-applicants correctly calculated these lines before submitting the application to CNCS. All right, so let's review some indirect cost line items. This first example shows the state subrecipient's indirect cost calculation using the 5-10% fixed option. As demonstrated, the Commission is retaining 1% of the CNCS share of costs. And additionally, the recipient is electing to claim less than the full 5% of the CNCS share and 10% of the grantee share. This is allowable, and when done, applicants should state the rate they're claiming in the cost calculation. This second example shows an applicant with a federally approved indirect cost rate. As requested in the application instructions, they provided the cost type, the basis, the approved rate, and the rate claimed, and detailed the cost calculation. In this situation, the Commission is again retaining 1% of the CNCS share of indirect cost. But because there isn't a Section 3B line for applicants to enter that portion of the cost, the applicant entered it in Section 3A, which is allowable. Alternatively, the applicant could have included the full $18,342 in Section 3B using the same cost calculation language, which refers to the 1% set aside for the Commission. And again, as a reminder, if you're using a negotiated indirect cost rate, you must enter the details of it in eGrants using that guidance in the application instructions. All right, the last section of the budget narrative is the source of funds section. In it, you will not list the budget sections or line item costs, but rather the source of those resources that are covering the specific line item expenses. So under budget section 3 tab, you'll find a link to enter source of matching funds as shown here. And once you click that link, a new screen will open for you to enter the source. Again, please be sure to note the amount of the match, if the match is secured or proposed, the classification, whether it's cash or in kind, and the type of source, private, state and local funds, or federal funds in the appropriate field. And I caution you to update this section as well as the indirect cost section after making any budget revisions so that they reflect all changes. The total in this section must equal the total amount of budgeted match exactly. When complete, the source of funds section might include content similar to this example. Note that this only includes the source of match, not the specific sections or line items covered by the matching funds. And there it shows that example of in-kind professional services donation that we referenced earlier. I will caution you when you're completing this section to take care using the drop-down menus. It's really easy to change the selected type of source, and incorrectly entering the source may result in additional clarifications. As I previously noted, a sample budget narrative from which I pulled these examples is on that FY 2020 NOFO page. So please feel free to use it as a resource when you're developing your own budget narrative. All right, Philip, do we have any other questions in the queue?
No, I'm not seeing any at this time.
Perfect. Well, before we close, I want to offer a few pointers, beginning with guidance to check and double check your work to eliminate erroneous information. Again, I must stress the benefits of involving your team and someone outside of the team in the budget development and review process. And I strongly recommend using the tips on this visual and in the budget checklist found in attachment F of the application instructions to make certain you submit an accurate budget narrative that meets the AmeriCorps requirements. Highlights of the budget checklist include a check to make sure it meets CNCS cost guidelines. Excuse me, is a full-time living allowance within the minimum and maximum levels? Is the cost per MSY less than or equal to $15,479 for cost reimbursement applications? And while eGrants will calculate this for you, you can get a head start on that by dividing the total amount of CNCS funds requested by the total number of MSYs requested. So if you've got an application for $100,000 in CNCS funds and 10 MSYs, the cost per MSY is $10,000. Does your budget include the minimum required match? And is the source of matching funds detailed and aligned with the amount of budgeted match? Exactly. You also want to check that the budget includes all required costs, such as your member gear, criminal history checks, member FICA, full-time member health care, along with those costs that CNCS strongly encourages applicants to include, such as CNCS technical assistance events and new staff attendance at AmeriCorps Symposium Pre-Con events. And as much as possible, due to eGrants character limits, the budget narrative should provide details, including the purpose and accurate calculations in whole dollars, and exclude any unallowable costs. I recommend that applicants use $0 line items to enter additional clarification if needed, such as that sample for the workers' compensation line that I showed you earlier. And please have someone check all the calculations before you submit. And finally, and most importantly, you should ensure that you aligned your budget narrative to the program goals in the application narrative, including miscellaneous, contingency, and other undefined budget amounts may adversely impact your application status. In addition, before submitting your application, please make sure your organization has an active central contractor registration with the System for Award Management, or SAMS.gov, a lot of people know it as. If you're applying for the first time, I recommend you apply early. Sometimes it takes a while to activate that registration. And please know this is a free service. You should never, ever, ever have to pay for a CCR registration. You also want to make sure that you submitted your most recent single audit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, if required, and your Form 990 to GuideStar. And that if you have one, you entered your current federally negotiated indirect cost rate details in eGrants. And details for all of these actions are in the NOFO and application instructions. Finally, CNCS is aware that on occasion applicants experience challenges with the eGrant system. eGrants automatically performs a limited compliance check to validate the budget, and it may result in a warning or an error message. Some of these messages prevent you from submitting your application, so you should be aware of the differences and the related actions. For instance, when you receive a warning, you can move forward, but the application or budget may not be compliant with the guidelines. And on the other hand, an error message will not allow you to move forward until you correct the error. You must resolve all errors before you can submit the application. If you experience a challenge other than a warning or an error message in eGrants, you should contact the National Service Hotline right away. Their number is 800-942-2677, and a link to the help request form is at the bottom of most eGrants pages. It's wise to forward a copy of the service ticket to AmeriCorps grants at cns.gov so we have documentation of the problem. All right, so let's check one more time. Philip, any other final questions?
Nothing that I'm seeing just yet in the final minutes of our session today.
All right, well, as a reminder, we will post a recording of the presentation on the NOFO website, along with the sample budget reference throughout the session. And I will encourage you to mark your calendar for the next session in our Technical Assistance Series, Best Practices in Developing Performance Measures, on November 6th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time.
Great. All right, well, thank you so much, Tracy and Philip, for all of your guidance. Like she said, we're going to post this on the NOFO page. I've been able to get that up in the next day or two, so you'll be able to revisit this quickly if you'd like. But if there are no open questions, which it looks like there are not, and we're at the end of our time, we will go ahead and conclude today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.